In this episode, we continue to look at those who we've lost, ages 22 and younger. In this episode, almost an entire band was wiped out by a plane crash. There was very little to be found on each member of the Bar-Kays as far as a history, but the Bar-Kays began in Memphis, Tennessee as a studio session group, backing major artists at Stack Records. Ben Colley was born in South Memphis, Tennessee. He learned to play trumpet when at school and formed a band with guitarist Jimmy King, saxophonist Fallon Jones, and drummer Carl Cunningham, keyboardist Ronnie Caldwell, and bassist James Alexander. The group was originally named the Imperials and later changed their name to the Bar-Kays. And in 1967, they were chosen by Otis Redding to play as his backing band and were tutored for that role by Al Jackson Jr., Booker T. Jones, and the other members of the Booker T's and the MGs. Right after high school graduation, they started touring with Redding and played over 100 shows around the country. Tragedy struck December 10th of 1967, just days after Redding recorded Sitting on the Dock of the Bay. The plane carrying Redding and the Bar-Kays members Jimmy King, Ronnie Caldwell, Fallon Jones, Carl Cunningham, and Ben Colley crashed into an icy lake near Madison, Wisconsin, while attempting to land at Truax Field. Alexander was supposed to be on that flight, but there was not enough room, so he flew on a different plane and was supposed to meet them there when they landed. They never showed, and Alexander got the call that he was needed. He was rushed to the scene, and he had to identify the bodies of his best friends. On this plane was Ronnie Caldwell, who was born December 27, 1948, Jimmy King, born June 8, 1949, Fallon Jones, unable to find a birth date. Ben Colley was the sole survivor of that accident.
Colley remembers that those aboard that flight also had a 17-year-old valet with them, Matthew Kelly. Because he was aboard, James Alexander took a different flight. Otis was talking about how he had just cut a record, and he said that they would have to hear it when they got back, and that he wanted them to put their horns to it. It was the first time that he had heard of the song Dock of the Bay, and it was the last thing that Otis talked about. Colley shared that all of them drifted off to sleep, and they were awakened by the plane shaking violently. Colley looked over at Jones, who was asking what was that, right before he looked out the window and yelled, "Oh no." Colley says that the last thing that he remembered was that he unbuckled his seatbelt. The next thing that he remembered was that he was holding a seat cushion and he was in the water. He said that he could hear his friends trying to save themselves. He said that he just kept thinking, "We're in the wrong place, man." He said that he remembers seeing Fallon, and he saw Carl come up and gasp for air. He also saw Ronnie come up. You see, Ben Colley didn't know how to swim, so he couldn't do much to help them. He was becoming numb, and his hands couldn't hold on any longer. Someone grabbed him. A man who lived on the lake saw the plane go down, and he'd hopped into his boat to go search for passengers. After getting Colley out of the water, he lay him on the boat beside the 3 others that were covered up with a tarp. Colley said that he remembered telling the old man that they were playing tonight, and that the old man told him, "You're lucky. You're the only one who lived." At this point, he thinks that he went into shock. Within weeks, Colley had flown to Memphis, overcoming his fear of flying, and he and Alexander reformed the Bar-Kays with more local musicians, many of whom also acted as pallbearers for the original members. And they were back out on the road barely a month after the accident. Some see this as a resiliency, and in part it is. The other part was contractual agreements that had to be met. In 1970, Collie and Alexander both named their firstborn sons after Fallon Jones. In December 2007, Ben Collie was interviewed about the accident, and he stated that even today, there's an eerie feeling that runs across him when he hears the song Sittin' on the Dock of the Bay.
Martin Francis Lamble was born August 28th of 1949. He was the drummer for British folk rock band Fairport Convention just after their formation in 1967. He joined the band after he attended their first gig, and he convinced them that he could do a better job than their current drummer could. Fairport Convention was a British folk rock band and that were heavily influenced by American folk rock singers and songwriters like Bob Dylan and Joni Mitchell. They also earned themselves the nickname the British Jefferson Airplane. Lamble played on the band's first 3 albums, but shortly after recording Unhalf Bricking, their 3rd album, and a week before it was released, on May 12, 1969, in the early morning hours, they were on their way home from a gig at Mother's, which is a club in Birmingham. Their van crashed on the M1 motorway. Apparently, the roadie Harvey Bramham was driving and he fell asleep. Witnesses said that not far from Scratchwood's service, the van veered off of the road and it crashed. It killed both Martin Lamble and Jeannie Franklin, who was also known as Jeannie the Tailor. She was an American clothing designer who designed clothing for Cream and other people, and she was the supposed girlfriend of one of the band members, Richard Thompson. The rest of the band suffered varying severity of injuries, except for Sandy, who was not in the van because she was traveling with her boyfriend instead. Now, they almost disbanded after this, but instead decided to live communally, and they brought in a new drummer, and they've gone on since then. Martin Lamble also played on Al Stewart's album Love Chronicles that was released in September of 1969. Also in September of 1969, Jack Bruce dedicated his solo album Songs for a Tailor in the memory of Jeannie. Some questioned why he did this. They did not realize at that point in time he had met her since she was the tailor for them. And in one of his later books, he disclosed that she was an ex-lover. Not much is really said about Martin Lamble prior to Fairport Convention. The most that I could find is that he had 2 younger brothers, and he was the oldest of his family. Some talk of the curse of Buddy Holly, and they cite multiple people who were somehow connected to him and who have died young. A last-minute addition in this age group and decade was one such person. Harold David Box, also known as David, was born August 11, 1943, in Sulphur Springs, Texas. His family moved to Lubbock in 1946. He was greatly influenced by his father, who was a self-taught Western swing fiddle player, and David started singing at public appearances by the age of 3. His father taught him to play guitar after he received one for his 8th birthday. He was greatly influenced by Buddy Holly, and in 1958, David formed his own band called the Ravens. The band cut their first demos at Mitchell's studio in Lubbock. As well as known for his voice and guitar style, he was also known for having looked remarkably like Buddy Holly. His friend and drummer Ernie Hall was a neighbor of Jerry Allison's parents. Jerry was a member of the Crickets. Ernie learned that they were looking for someone to play guitar and sing lead, since another Cricket, Sonny Curtis, had been drafted into the Army. The Ravens sent in demos, auditioned, and both David and Ernie went to Los Angeles to cut the Crickets' next single in 1960. This single comprised of a song written by David and Ernie called Don't You Know. It was on the A side, and on the back was a cover of Buddy Holly's song Peggy Sue Got Married. On the Crickets album, they decided to go with the original arrangement of the song, but they still used David's lead vocals for it. This was the final single by the Crickets on Coral Records. David and Ernie spent 3 weeks touring with the Crickets after this, before finally returning home so that they could complete their schooling. Box also collaborated with Roy Orbison during this time, and he did find local success with his group, the Ravens. On October 23, 1964, David and two friends reportedly playfully abducted Bill Daniels, who was a pilot, as he was walking to a college class, and said, "Let's go flying." The Cessna 172 Skyhawk was found later crashed, nose first, and overturned in a field in the Houston area, killing all aboard. Box was inducted posthumously into the West Texas Hall of Fame and the Buddy Holly Walk of Fame in Lubbock in September 2006. Out of the Box, the 50th anniversary tribute to David Box songs, was released October 2014. In the next episode, we will be looking at those who passed away between the ages of 22 and 17 during the 1970s.